¿Le das a grabar, por favor? Eduardo.
Sí. No sé.
Ya está.
¿Ya, Eduardo?
Ya.
Vale, gracias. Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la 8ª sesión sobre lingüística materialista. Hoy tenemos a la profesora y doctora Daria Zalesskaya. El mes que viene tendremos, y ya lo anunciamos, al profesor de la Universidad de Aalborg en Dinamarca, Óscar García Agustín, que nos va a hablar del nuevo discurso de la extrema derecha. Y hoy, como digo, tenemos el gusto de presentar a Daria Zalesskaya. Es profesora asociada en la sección de lenguas y civilizaciones eslavas de la Universidad de Lausanne, en Suiza, desde el año 2020. Su tesis doctoral, la cual defendió el mismo año, estuvo consagrada a los aspectos lingüísticos de las civilizaciones en manuales de ruso como lengua extranjera para alumnos francófonos publicados durante el siglo XX y fue dirigida por la profesora Ekaterina Belmezova. Sus intereses de investigación giran en torno a la didáctica de las lenguas, la eslavística, así como la historia y la epistemología de las ideas lingüísticas. Actualmente enseña cursos sobre lengua rusa y epistemología y didáctica en la misma Universidad de Lausanne, en Suiza. La conferencia será en inglés, pero la presentación en formato PowerPoint será en español, ya que tenemos amigos y amigas que nos visitan desde diversas partes del mundo. Pues cuando quieras, Daria.
Muchas gracias. Hola and hello. And I thank you for your attendance. And I'm especially grateful to Pedro for his invitation, and to Pedro and Eduardo for their work and assistance. Thank you very much. I also would like to express my gratitude to my colleagues who helped me personally or by their works to prepare for this presentation. So Ekaterina Vermezova, Elena Simonata, and Patrick Seriou. I will speak English, and I apologize in advance for possible mistakes. It's a really challenge for me. One thing to outline is that main goal of my presentation today is to present you a brief rundown of some ideas, because the works of Soviet linguists in the 19th and 30s deserve greater and detailed consideration, even some lecture series. Today, I would like to present you a brief excursion into the linguistic ideas that prevailed in the USSR in the 20s and 30s of the last century. I would like to find out, on the example of studies by some linguists, which of their ideas influence modern science, either explicitly or implicitly. It's very difficult, speaking about these linguists, to really draw the line between different activities of modern science. That's why it will be very conditional. Because the linguists that I'll speak about today worked and had sometimes different opinions that they have expressed on the same aspect. To begin with, I invite you to get acquainted with the general historical background, since it is the spirit of the time and the spirit of the place that determine many of ideas that arise in a particular era. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was, of course, the decisive event, which led to the end of Russian monarchy and establishment of Russian provisional government. The revolution has also resulted in the explosion of different changes, new ideas in brand new areas. It should be noted that the 20s and 30s were very rich, including in terms of scientific research, in the soon-to-be USSR, since the USSR as a state was officially established in 1922. Before we come directly to linguistics, I would like to point out that the early USSR and that USSR was imagined firmly entrenched in the world perception are two quite different states. It can be said that in the beginning, it felt like more freedom in all areas, quite natural. And in the post-revolutionary years, almost all selectors faced many new challenges and new objectives. The same was the situation in linguistics. One of the post-revolutionary aspirations was striving to abandon the old and to make everything new and genuine. Given that there was simply no definite system and concept, it is quite natural that in the first decade after the revolution, including the 20s and 30s, we can identify several trends in the Soviet linguistics which was based on different theoretical principles. However, considering both the spirit of the time and the spirit of the place, virtually all researchers, with some exceptions, were united to a greater or a lesser extent by the common task of building up Marxist linguistics throughout the very understanding of the ways to build. It was heterogeneous among them. In fact, the question about the essence of the methodological foundation of the Marxist linguistics was the main one in numerous and often very hot debates and discussion of the first 2 decades in the Soviet linguistics. Unfortunately, some of these arguments were completely unfounded, since some of participants in such discussions had no relevant education and did not understand the fundamentals. There were many questions to discuss. What is a Marxist linguistics? What are its goals and objectives? What are its methods? Many people, both professional linguists and those who were far from linguistics, work on these issues. Let me mention the main ones. First, a large group of major linguists who continued the tradition of the Moscow and Kazan schools, sometimes quite consistently, sometimes with some individual modification. In terms of methods, they mainly defended the principle of traditional comparative historical linguistics. Second, Nikolai Marr, the author of the new doctrine about language, or Japhetitology, and his followers. This school sharply broke with the scientific tradition of linguistics, declaring it bourgeois, and on the basis of vulgarly interpreted materialistic assumptions, they made an attempt to create a completely original linguistic concept. Third, Igor Meshaninov, a student of Nikolai Marr and the successor of his work on developing the theoretical principles of the new doctrine about language, whose activities and those of his affiliated linguists are distinguished by rejecting the extremist conclusions by Nikolai Marr, abandoning many of his fundamental ideas, and striving to find ways of reconciliation with some schools of Soviet and foreign linguistics. And fourth, the concept by Lev. I'm sorry, I have some problems with my laptop. Excuse me. And fourth, the concept by Lev Scherba, a student of Baudouin de Courtenay, one of the most popular linguists that I'll speak later, in the Petrograd period of his activities. So Petrograd, now it's called St. Petersburg, and in Soviet period, it was Leningrad. Scherba, in the post-October time of his scientific activities, developed several interesting and fruitful ideas that provide him with an independent position in the Soviet language science. The school of Lev Scherba, which had a large number of followers, exerted a significant influence on the subsequent development of the Soviet linguistics. So I think I will do like that, don't have problems then. I can also mention an aggressive group, which, however, quickly crumbled away, known as Языко front or linguistic front, intermediate in theoretical term between traditional linguistics and Japhetidology, and also the ideas of the sociological school were reflected in the activities of Rosalia Osipovna Shor. Also worthy of mention is Opoyaz. So it's Society of the Study of the Theory of Poetic Languages, which extended from 1940 to 1923. Some of these members who moved to Czechoslovakia contributed to creating the Prague Linguistic Circle and the emergence of functional linguistics. As you can see, the 20s and 30s were marked by a large number of studies and publications by outstanding Russian linguists of the post-revolutionary period, who largely contributed to researching the problems of the structural articulation of language, its functional and external relation, problem of the language sign and the language's position among other sign systems. Based on the data of Russian, Slavic, Germanic, Romance languages, these researchers put forward original ideas to the field of phonetics and phonology, lexicology and lexicography, morphology, word formation, syntax, stylistics, and cultural speech, literary language, and its development. In their studies, these scientists created the main feature of the Soviet theoretical linguistics: interest in the problem of the language sociology, language typology, attention to the language content component, striving to study the dynamics of language processes, to identify intra-system linguistic relationship, to research history of a language in connection with the history of the people speaking this language, etc. In the studies under consideration, this feature received different interpretation depending on the specific topic, individual interest, etc. And all this feature had many different interpretations. The victory of the October Social Revolution caused drastic change not only in the social and economic relations, but also in science. Science, including linguistics, were brought to serve the people, the new society whose practical needs they were intended to satisfy. The language science acquired those practical importance. This was primarily due to the fact that a huge number of previously illiterate people got access to Russian and world culture. The functional role of the Russian language was changed, and it became the language of interactive communication. The massive speech of literacy continued. Here, I cannot do not to say and note that many people, at least in the post-Soviet space, believe that only after the Bolsheviks came to power, the work of wide dissemination of literacy and education was started among the population. In fact, that it's not quite true. Yes, the Bolsheviks actually paid great attention to increasing the people's literacy. But this work has been also carried out before the revolution. In 1889, the shape of literary men in the Russian Empire was 31%, and that of women 30%, which of course it's very little, if not even negligible. By 1930, this figure doubled, as well as the number of students of higher education institutions. So this process was launched during the reign of Nicholas II. In a sense, it was a continuation of an already existing practice. The same applies to the reform of the Russian orthography in 1917-1918, the project of which had been developed before the revolution, but introduced already by the provisional government, which intended the immigrated aristocracy's refusal to use it, just because the reform was carried out by the Bolshevik government, according, for example, to the poet Bunin. There is still a newspaper in the United States that publishes Russian text using the pre-reform spelling. Thus, along with the speech of literature, it is worth noting the expanded use of Russian and national languages, the practical task of creating new literary languages, and the reflection of grandiose revolutionary process in the language. All this set for linguists such a task and problems that the former domestic linguistic had never faced. A feature of that time was a desire to derive immediately practical benefit from any research. Meanwhile, there were a lot of tasks: creation of a written language for numerous languages with no written form, which are essentially unexplored, the dissemination of the literary language among working people, methods of teaching foreign European language to be widely introduced to the populace and other tasks. Famous Soviet linguists Zinder and Stroeva remember that the climate that prevailed in the Soviet linguistic in 1920s and 1930s could be described as a period of research. They wrote, it was a search for new topics, new material, new ways, and most importantly, new methodological foundations that linguists sought to draw from the materialist Marxist philosophy. So, as you can see, the spirit of the time and the spirit of the place were exceptional in this period and created a lot of ideas and interpretations, sometimes completely new, sometimes based on previous research. The historical context made a lot of new context, which, and this is very important, an immediate practical application to the current situation. The new favorable political approach to national languages adds complementary to Soviet linguistic immediate task to solve. Before the revolution, the dominant language in all Russian Empire was Russian. In some regions, the language politic was harsh. It was completely prohibited to use officially any other language aside of Russian. Not only all official documents, but also books, theater performances, newspapers, etc. must be only in Russian. The first year before the revolution, the situation was the other way around completely. And then after 1930s, it was a new change to yet again favorize the Russian language. Our linguists worked in a very interesting context, trying also to create the Marxist linguist, because according to Soviet linguist Yakovlev, Marx and Engels don't have anything in their teachings about language at all or enough. And this newly formed teaching should have met the society needs. Today, I would like to dwell on the studies of several linguists. First, I want to provide a brief overview of their lives. As the history of science, it's not only the history of ideas, but also the history of people involved in it. The first of those I would like to mention, it's Mikhail Bakhtin, a philosopher, historian, and literary critic. Strictly speaking, he was not a linguist in the full sense of the word. However, he is the author of studies covering such problems of language and stylistics, speech genders, and general theoretical issues. He was also the intellectual leader of the scientific and philosophical club known as Bakhtin's Circle. Bakhtin was born in Orel in a large family who later moved to Vilna and then to Odessa. His father was a bank clerk. After 1918, Bakhtin lived in Nevel, where he taught to join the labor school. There, he built up a close group of like-minded intellectuals and published his first paper entitled Art and Responsibility in 1919. After 1920, he lived in Vitebsk, where he taught the Pedagogical Institute and the Conservatory, gave public lectures on philosophy, aesthetics, and literature. His acquaintances included Voloshiny. In 1920 and 1924, he worked on philosophical treatise left unfinished, and on the early edition his book about Dostoevsky. In 1924, he returned to Leningrad at the invitation for his friend Medvedev, who had previously moved there. The Bakhtin's group continued home disputes and seminars on the philosophy of religion, ethics, and literature. They also discussed Freud with his theory of psychoanalysis. On June 28, he made a presentation, The Problem of the Hero and the Author in Art, in the Institute of Art History. In December 1928, Bakhtin was arrested along with a number of other Leningrad intellectuals. In 1929, Bakhtin was released from prison under house arrest due to his illness, but later, while he was in a hospital, he was sentenced in absentia to 5 years in the Solovki, that's a prison camp. Thanks to the effort of his wife and friends, The sentence was changed to 5 years of exile in Kostanay. In June 1929, Bakhtin published his first monography, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. After the end of his exile in 1936, due to the ban on living in large cities, Bakhtin got a job in the Moldova State Pedagogical Institute in Saransk. But in 1937, he was forced to leave the city, and until 1945, he lived in the Savelovo railway station in the Kalinin region, where he worked as a school teacher. In 1946, at the Institute of World Literature in Moscow, Bakhtin defended his candidate thesis on Rabelais in the history of realism, and was awarded the academic degree of Candidate of Science. In the same year, he returned to Saransk, where until 1961, he worked in the Department of General Literature, and practically forgotten by his contemporaries. Between 1930 and 1963, he published almost nothing, except for the minor newspapers items. Bakhtin returned to USSR scientific space in the 1960s due to the help of like-minded people who recognized him as their teacher. In 1969, thanks to the patronage of Yuri Andropov, who ordered to find a decent apartment for the theorist of literature, Bakhtin moved from Saransk to Moscow. And in 1917, Bakhtin was admitted to the British Union. In the 1960s and 1970s, Bakhtin's papers were published in edition of Institute of World Literature on the Russian Academy of Science. He was able to publish his book about Rabelais, republish the book about Dostoevsky, in fact, its new edition, then prepare a collection of articles on literature entitled Literature and Aesthetics, Study of Different Years. He died on March 1975. The second one is Valentin Voloshinov, who was an adept of the mystical society of when he was a young man. Even before the revolution, he became a close friend of Mikhail Bakhtin and a member in the Nevesque School of Philosophy. He studied at the law faculty Petrograd University, but interrupted his education in 1916. In 1919-1922, he lived in Nevel, then in Vitebsk, published several papers on music, lectured on art history and theory of literature at the first proletarian university in Vitebsk. In 1922, he returned to Petrograd, where after Bakhtin moved there in the spring of 1924. They continued their close communication. Voloshinov graduated from Leningrad University at the Department of Social Science in 1924, specializing in linguistics. Was a graduate student of the Research Institute for the Comparative History of Literature and Languages on the West and the East countries. Then an associate professor, at Leningrad Pedagogical Institute, Institute of Speech Culture, and Leningrad Institute for Advanced Training of Artworks. In the last year of his life, he was seriously ill with tuberculosis and could not work and even read. Let's pass to Evgeny Polivanov, another prominent linguist of the time, who was born in Smolensk and an impoverished noble family. In 1908, he graduated from the Riga Alexandros Gymnasium and went to study in St. Petersburg, where he got 2 philological education. In 1911, he graduated from the Practical Oriental Academy in the Japanese section, and in 1912, the Historical and Philological Faculty of St. Petersburg University. Among his university teachers were 2 greatest Russian linguists of that time, Baudouin de Courtenay and Sherba. Polivanov's linguistics ideas were developed under their influence. Within the next 2 years after graduation, Polivanov had to work in several places and wants to make a living, where he taught French, Russian, and Latin languages, as well as general phonetics. Along with teaching, he was engaged in the study of languages and published his first scientific papers. Thus, in 1914, he published a comparative phonetic overview of the Japanese and Ryukyu languages, where Polyvanov made an attempt to identify the common origins of the Japanese language and the distantly related dialects of the Ryukyu islands. Polyvanov made his first trip to Japan, sponsored by the Russian-Japanese Society in May 1914. Upon arrival to Nagasaki, the researcher visited the fishing village of Mi. Studying the local dialect, which was largely different from the literary language, Polyvanov spent most of the summer in this village. After Nagasaki, Polyvanov went to Kyoto, the former capital of Japan, where he studied the Kyoto dialect. At the end of his trip, Polyvanov visited Tokyo, where he also studied the local speech. In addition, he hoped to meet speakers of various dialects in the capital. From October 5 to 3rd, 1940, the linguist worked at the phonetics laboratory of the Tokyo Imperial University, communicating with Japanese linguists and his compatriots, specialists in Japanese philology. However, the funds received from the Russian-Japanese Society were almost spent, and in late October, early November, Polyvanov returned to St. Petersburg, that had been renamed into Petrograd during that time. Until spring, he analyzed the materials collected, passed his master's exam, and was planning his next trip to Japan, after having found funds for it. In total, Polyvanov visited Japan 3 times and did a great job. For example, he studied a large number of Japanese dialects and created phonetic dictionaries. In Petrograd, Polyvanov, who had established himself as a scientist due to his publication on Japanese linguistics, was invited to the position of an assistant professor at the Department of Japanese. This was contrary to tradition. People who did not graduate from the faculty were not elected to this position. Polyvanov was invited by Mar, Dean of the Faculty of Oriental Studies. And Polyvanov gave various courses focusing on phonetic and dialectology. He started publishing his expedition results, including his book. In 1940, a friendly circle of formalist philologists was emerging in Petrograd, which later became known as OPOYAS, so it's Society of the Study of the Theory of Poetic Language. One of its founders was Polyvanov, who joined Jakubinski in the second half of 1940. His articles were included in the first collection of the Theory of Poetic Language, published in autumn 1960, one of the main publications of OPOYAS. Polyvanov was not only engaged in scientific activities, but he also led an active political life. During the October Revolution, he joined the Bolsheviks, and after November 1970, he acted as one of the 2 deputies for the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Trotsky. In particular, he prepared the initial text of the Brest Peace Treaty. Fulfilling a government assignment, Polyvanov translated and published the secret treaties of the Tsarist government with other states. However, in early 1980, there was a conflict between Polyvanov and Trotsky, as the People's Commissar accused the scientists of abuse of office. Polyvanov was put under investigation, but finally he was acquitted. After this conflict, Polyvanov resigned from the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs, but continued his political work without abandoning his scientific studies and teaching. Combining political, scientific, and teaching activities, Polyvanov joined the Russian Communist Bolshevik Party in 1990 and was awarded the title of professor at the age of 28. In 1921, he moved to Moscow, where he started working as the deputy head of the Far Eastern Department of the Comintern and led the Eastern sector of the Communist University of Workers of the East. In the same year, Polyvanov was sent to Tashkent to work there. Since the end of the same year, he worked as a professor at Central Asian University and deputy chairman of the State Scientific Board of the Turkestan Republic. During this period, Polivanov started his research for the Central Asian languages. In 1922, at the second of the Congress of Uzbek Educators, he made a presentation of the Latin alphabet for the Uzbek language. A year later, his brochure was published, dedicated to reforming the graphic of some Turkic languages. Then he continued studying the Uzbek writing and published an article on the Kazakh graphics. In autumn 1926, Polivanov was invited to Moscow, where he was actively engaged in scientific activities. He published several scientific studies on language of the USSRs and the East peoples, including Introduction to Linguistics for Oriental Studies Universities. In 1928, Polivanov was elected to the scientific board of the All-Union Central Committee of the New Turkish Alphabet. In the same year, in the collection entitled Culture and Written Languages of the East and in periodicals, Polivanov published his paper summarizing the results of his work related to the activities of the scientific board and the commission. In addition, he continued writing reviews articles where he gave a general outline of the graphic reform for peoples of the USSR. In 1923-1924, the new doctrine of languages, so Japhetic theory, was developed, the author of which was Nikolai Marr. The academic and scientific authority, his ideas about the universal language, and his sharp hostility to the bourgeois science of the West and pre-revolutionary Russia attracted many influential people into the ranks on his allies, including those from the highest governmental bodies. By the end of the 1920s, Marxism, supported by authorities, has actually become a monopolistic trend in Soviet linguistics. All the linguists should fully acknowledge the new doctrine of language and follow its ideas. All other scientific schools were being eradicated. Few people dared to oppose this pseudo-scientific doctrine, and Polivanov was one of them. Initially, he was indifferent about the Mars theory and even found some valuable ideas therein. However, while positively assessing the Nikolai Marr's achievements in the comparative historical study of the South Caucasian languages, he could not accept the Japhetic theory as unfounded by linguistic facts. In February 1929, Polivanov spoke at the Communist Academy. In his speech, he convincingly revealed the lack of proof and fallacy of the Mars constitutions. However, the Marxists responded to Polivanov in the spirit of accusatory polemics. The mood of the audience, where no linguist predominated, was also against him, and the scientist was defeated. From that day on, a targeted bulletin of Polivanov was launched, and he could work no longer in Moscow. In 1929, Polivanov left for Samarkand, where he worked at the Uzbek State Research Institute, and in 1931, he moved with the institute to Tashkent. But even in Central Asia, the Marxists continued to persecute him. In the same year, Polivanov managed to publish his book for Marxist linguistics, where he criticized Marxism again. After that, the bullying gained new strength, and Polivanov was deprived of the opportunity to publish his works in Moscow and Leningrad. One of his last published papers was an article of the Japanese language in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. Since 1934, Polivanov lived in Kyrgyzstan and worked as a professor at the Kyrgyz Institute for Cultural Construction. Along with teaching, he was actively engaged in the study of Dungan language and translated the Kyrgyz epic. In 1937, the linguist was arrested and transported to Moscow. Polivanov was accused of working for foreign intelligence and espionage and sent to prison. The scientist was tortured to give a false testimony. And in 1938, Polivanov pleaded not guilty to the court. He said that he had always worked honestly and had never been a spy. The court declared him guilty of crimes and sentenced him to capital punishment. On the same day, Polivanov was shot and buried on the spot. Subsequently, the scientist was rehabilitated. And the last linguist for today is that I would like to speak today is Lev Jakubinski. Born in Kiev, he studied at the school, the Cadet Corps, and in 1999 entered the Historical Philological Faculty of Kiev University, then transferred to St. Petersburg University, which he graduated from 1930. He studied he was a student of Baudouin de Courtenay, Shakhmatova and Lev Sherba. He was an OPS with Polivanov. Courses taught on the University Lesgafta, and he read in many universities and colleges. And it was also the director of the Institute of Linguistics. And from 1934 and to 1943, he worked mainly in more also university as a professor, and he was engaged in problems of learning the art of speech, comparative historical studies of Slavic languages, the history of Russian, and one of his alma classic works, article on the dialogue speech, which interests in the study of conversational speech that I will speak a little bit later. As you can see, the life of linguist was sometimes good, but mostly cruel. There is an opinion that the revolution devoured its sons, and maybe it's true regarding, for example, the destiny of Polivanov. We also can suppose that these linguists were born not in a good time for their ideas, but it's not my area of studies, to be honest. Many researchers of these linguists were forgotten just after 1930s, but brought to light again years after, and we must pay tribute to young Soviet linguists, pioneers of a lot of contemporary science ideas. Due to the fact that all mentioned linguists did researches in practically the same areas, but has sometimes different or opposite opinions. I propose to start by sociology and semiotics, and then pass to linguistics and teaching of language. So, sociolinguistics and semiotics. Speaking about sociolinguistics, it is necessary to say that it was maybe practically the most important topic in 1920s, 1930s years due to Marxism and current situation in URSS. Literally, all linguists work on this. We can find all times a trace of sociology in their works. And the specialists say the problem of the sociolinguistic were theoretically conceptualized by Polivanov. The range of problems in sociological linguistics outlined by him included the definition of language as a social and historical fact, the description of languages and dialects from a sociological point of view, the study of causal relationship between socioeconomic and linguistic phenomena, the development of language policy. Summing up the evolution of the Soviet linguistics in 1970-1927, Polivanov wrote, "The science of language should be a sociological science, the first and essential prerequisite. It suffers the center of gravity to the sociological component in studying a language. The revolution in linguistics in our country has manifested itself primarily in the emergence of new, namely sociological research topics and tasks." I propose to analyze one of the most popular work who treats social and semiotic problems, but before I would also like to note the need to distinguish the academic Marxism or unorthodox Marxism from the official Marxism. The researcher Dmitriev distinguishes the academic Marxism not as a social and political ideology, but as a special method for analyzing social facts. That is, we are talking about a meta-theory of the humanities and social science, rather than a political practice. And the work that we will see now must, as is mentioned by Patrick Sirot, treat through the prism of academic Marxism and not of official Marxism. Now, the Voloshinov book, Marxism and Philosophy of Language, is very popular. But historically, this work was completely forgotten since 1930s in URSS, and it's not known abroad. To be honest, it is difficult to imagine a more inappropriate historical moment for publishing Marxism and Philosophy of Language. 1929 was a year of the Great Break, the era when scientific discourse became the object of ideological control by the party. Prior to his moment, there had been very diverse ways to be Marxist in the Soviet Union, often contradicting each other, as I already spoke yet. Any new idea, any original and tradition-destroying research had been proclaimed Marxist. More specifically, given that for various idealistic trends in Germany, the science with which they had to fight was positivism, Marxism became an attractive and trustworthy alternative. Marxism and the philosophy of language was rediscovered in the West in 1970s due to famous linguist Roman Jakubson, and he really hit it. The book was well received by West public. For more information, I recommended you to read the works of Patrick Sérieux about the subject. The work is very sinful to give some analysis for our today's topic. It's also important to notice that sometimes the name of Bakhtin appeared on the cover, and it's used to be that some people believe that it's Bakhtin who wrote this book. Voloshinov gave any definition nature to Marxism. And I'm sorry, I have how many times? Pedro?
Dime.
¿Cuánto tiempo tengo?
Un cuarto de hora, 20 minutos. 20 minutos.
Gracias. Gracias. Ulala. Voloshinov gave any definition neither to Marxism, not the philosophy of language. His goal was to outline the main direction of a truly Marxist thinking about the language. So we can find in the works of Marxism and philosophy of language some definition like the modo de ver el mundo, the worldview, or science of the ideological creativity, or sociological method. For Voloshinov, the sociology of language is not sociolinguistics. In his book, we cannot find heteroglossia. He did not pay attention to the diversity of the language. He was not interested in the language of proletarians, workers, sailors, soldiers, or peasants, and like Jakubinski. And at the same time, he sincerely despised linguistics experiments or futurist poets. His taste remained completely classic. And Voloshinov did not adopt the official ideology. His Marxism is so unusual that he would bring only the stand of hostile reviews to the author, and his name would soon disappear from public life. Therefore, as noted by Patrick Sérieux, Marxism and philosophy of language is neither a linguistic treatise, not a lecture on the Marxist philosophy, but rather something like a social, psychological, and semiotic theory of verbal behavior and interpersonal interaction in a system of thinkings where artists, creation, and life constantly reflect to each other. Following, in the second part, Marxism, for example, is mentioned only in the title. And in the first part of the book, it is not mentioned at all. Only the first part presents a discussion of Marxism, suggesting that the ideological thing becomes the arena of the class struggle. But at the same time, this thing of neutral, it was this feature of Voloshinov Marxism that caused him to greatest number to attract by his contemporaries from the very moment when the demand for Marxism orthodoxy became a matter of life or death. For Voloshinov, it's really for Voloshinov, the social group, it's a really the unique constant, and he said that without the social group, concrete social group, it is not possible to exist to existence. And the definition of group it's a communication with the same life experience and interpersonal interactions at the language. And for Voloshinov, the object of study in the Marxist linguistics, it's enunciado that I will speak a little bit later. It's really the proper subject of study for the new Marxist philosophy of language. The subject is that utterance a real unit of speech, which is always unique, concrete, and included in the situation which Voloshinov called social, since it's necessary to assume the presence of several people, at least a speaker and listener, who make up to the audience on this utterance. Once again, note that social psychology is manifested in just such an amazing neighborhood. Indeed, the goal of linguistics for Voloshinov was to study utteration of the connection with the social environment, causing this interesting. And for Voloshinov, it's really important the concept of the situation. The situation is a totality of everything you need to know to understand an utterance. The intertext by Voloshinov suggests and even asserts that it is enough to know the situation of an utterance to understand its meaning. Anyone who knows how to restore the situation in this singularity in integrity is able to fully understand the only correct meaning in the utterance. Therefore, the meaning of the utterance is fully clear without any misunderstanding and diversion throughout the specific situation. As I said before, Marxism is that is referred to the ideological scene philosophy. One of the Voloshinovsky theses, which the subordinate defended, was that there cannot be nature context without form, not form without content. There is no experience outside its sign implementation. Therefore, from the very beginning, there can be no question of a fundamental qualitative difference between the internal and the external. Voloshinov gives a classical dual definition of the sign. This is a thing that does not express anything in itself, but this is a symbol because it refers to another thing. Such are the hammer and sickle on the coat of arms of the Soviet state. The thing is nothing more than ideology, even if it's only the ideology of everyday life. It can distort, refract, but at the same time, it reflects. One thing is undeniable. It is not about belonging of the sign or to the category of symbolic, even to a lesser extent to the category of imaginary, but about the sign as a thing put in place of. So here's one of the main aphorisms of Marxism and philosophy of language. Where is there no sign, there is no ideology. Could be read as follows: where is there no form, there is no content, and vice versa. His rejection of linguistics as such is fully manifested there. The study of phonetics and morphology, as it can be found with Ferdinand de Saussure, applies only to the form, therefore it cannot be scientific, because the form that it's not related to the content, it's not a subject of study for him. Voloshinov's Marxism and philosophy of language, it's not just a hyper-sociological study, but a much more hyper-semiotic one. Everything is a sign and nothing that is objective. It's a purely economic and material factor. It cannot exist outside of expression or embodiment in signs. Hence, it is not surprising that consonants is completely equal in volume to the sign that expresses. Thinking is nothing but words. Thus, words are social sign, and therefore any truth and any internal dialogue consisting of words. That is why it can be fully understood and comprehended through self-observation. And speaking about Bakhtin, you can say that the main studies by Bakhtin were soon translated and became widely known in the West. And now we have a tradition to consider the ideas of Bakhtin as one of the most important persons for semiotics. And we can also say that we're speaking about the Bakhtin's myth. And one of the stones of this Bakhtin's myth was the problem of the traduction of works of Bakhtin in French. And one of translation, not even of Bakhtin, but also in Voloshinov, because he also speaks about that in Marxism and philosophy on language. As in the Russian term высказывание can be translated in French in two ways. So, énoncé or enunciado in español, or énonciation. The term enunciation signifies enunciation. And at this time, the French linguist Émile Beneviste, who worked in different areas of linguistics and was one of predecessors of ethnolinguistics and cognitive linguistics, worked also with the concept of enunciation act. And Bakhtin's works was translated using the term enunciation and not énoncé. The most interesting is that even the researchers who knows Russian and French doesn't speak about this misunderstanding. The reason can be multiple and maybe social or political, but it's not my area to work. And I really recommended to read works of Patrick Siro and Ekaterina Vermezova about this topic. And of course, passing to linguistics works have a lot of impact on modern linguistics. First, of course, as I mentioned, is one of articles of Elena Simonata it's the phonology. Our linguist worked not really from zero. In Russian tradition, it was already Baudouin de Courtenay who has a lot of researches on this topic. Of course, a lot of works about phonology we can find among Polivanov, as I mentioned, in a part of his biography. Voloshinov also can be mentioned as another Soviet linguist, Yakovlev. Article of Elena Simonata published in Revista Refraction is perfect, and I recommend you to read it. In the 1930s, linguists still did not have a clear distinction between the concept of literary and national languages, not clarity in the development of this concept. There was no concept of the norm as a specific problem of the literary language. At the time, theoretical issues of the literary language were studied mainly in a sociological light, asserting a direct dependence of the literary language formation on social and economic factors. This was especially evident in the book by Ivanov and Jakubinski, Essays of Language, where the authors divided the class-specific languages on the peasantry and the proletariat, and in the book and in other books. For example, Zhmursky, National Language and Social Dialects, published in 1936, in the was of influence of Jakubinski. Way back to Polivanov, because of his life, he was, to be honest, the first who found the contrastive linguistics as a practical oriented linguistic approach that seeks to describe the difference and similarity between a pair of languages, and not in 1967. In accordance of contrastive linguistics, he creates a theoretical base of comparisons between mother tongue and foreign language and use it to create the foreign language learning. We need to say that the numerous linguistic specialties of Polivanov, including language teaching, in particular at the national school. His comments on these issues were based on his extensive personal experience. First of all, let us mention Polivanov's own methodological ideas. It was he who came up with what is now called an educational kit. This is a kit, like, for example, as he said, for Uzbek school children, he should include a student book and a book for reading, a Russian Uzbek dictionary, and a collection of diagrams, so phraseological units of the Russian language with example. Polivanov insisted on the essential need for differentiated textbook of the Russian language for different nationality, emphasizing, however, that one could rely on both genetically close languages and general typological similarity. And he was the author of the idea that one should first teach the acoustic recognition of Russian sounds, then the reproduction, and only then the hearing and pronunciation as part of a whole word. The most general idea of Polivanov, at first glance a rather trivial one, is the impossibility of creating a full-fledged methodology for teaching a language without using the data of scientific linguistics. And he was really interested about phonological teaching of phonological part of teaching. Polivanov was perhaps the first to raise the question of a systematic analysis of linguistic facts for the purpose of language teaching. As early as in 1924, he referred to the system principle, considering it highly desirable for students to be able not only to imitate the pronunciation on the relevant phonemes, but also to understand then mutual relations. The principle of subjectivity applies not only to qualitative characteristic of individual phonetic representation, but even to the number of phonemes in the given set. Thus, the Russian word drama can only be interpreted by the Japanese as dorama or durama, and starik are received by Koreans as tarik. For example, skazal, donc said, can be like kazal. It's even more important how the difference in the acoustic and articulatory structure of a syllable aspect its subjective perception. Tuning on the problems of mastering the grammatical component of a language, we should first note that Polivanov did not envision the study of grammar as an independent and self-contained course. In particular, based on the idea of a natural relationship between different levels within the integral system of language, he required to link certain morphological facts with certain phonetic exercises. For example, it will be natural to associate setting not a final stress with learning to the declination of feminine nouns and just such cases as vody and vody, nogi and nogi, etc., or learning plural form ending with an a, accented such as doctor, доктора, город, города, войска, войска, etc. By the way, these examples very clearly demonstrate how Polivanov consistently strove to present any phenomenon on the studied language in terms of its functions. And for Polivanov, it was really important that all educational process passed with, first of all, the formal description of the content, and then it was really important to add the functional value. He also included the idea of intermediate language. And speaking about looking at Polivanov didactic ideas, we can make several conclusions according to the actual situation in didactics of language. To be honest, a lot of Polivanov's topics are currently largely using in language teaching. The first example is teaching according to the particularity of mother tongue of students. In my university, for example, we use mostly for Russian language students the student books that are made specifically for native French speakers. Here we have in French, cours pratique pour francophones, the practical course for French speakers. This is a large practice at school and university when the mass of students with the same mother tongue learn the foreign language. Throughout this, the study process have many benefits. The possibility to focus on difficult moments due to the particular mother tongue, the possibility to animate the course with some interesting cultural and civilization information different to mother culture. For example, Russian students has some problems with article in the system of times in English, French or Spanish in the level to grammar, because we don't have it in Russia. The place of words in the sentence in the level of syntax, pronunciation of nasal sounds in French, voiceless dental fricative the in English and Spanish, in the level of pronunciation, etc. So that's because we don't possess it in our language. And French students of Russian, for their part, have some problems with movement verbs, pronunciation of "ü", grammatical aspects, or declension. We decline literally almost all that we can decline in Russian. The idea of Polivanov's educational kit is used in one way or another in practically all of modern students' books, but a little bit different. Usually, modern books are divided: students' book and workbook. But in students' book, there are in the end of book a little dictionary, grammar, summary, additional information, etc. Here we have, for example, the workbook and student book on English, or students' book, workbook in Spanish. With Polivanov idea that every part of language grammar more specifically shouldn't be an independent and self-contained course, we can say that he developed the communicative language teaching method that we use actually many decades before and jumped many teaching methods like natural method, audiovisual method, etc. Here are some examples from English and Spanish student books. So as you can see, the grammar is all time according in the topic, and it will never teaching without the context. For example, in English, it's adjective for personal qualities. How can you make it within a grammar part? Some Polivanov ideas can also help us to resolve actual problems in language teaching due to globalization. How to teach difficult languages, problem to learning without the intermediate language, and of course, that I mentioned before, the particularities of foreign language and mother tongue of students. And now doing the globalization, we have these problems when we teach the foreign languages. And Soviet linguists in 1920s, 1930s years worked in different areas, and these ideas influence the current areas of science. In sociolinguistics, we can mention it as the studies of social conflicts, using of language like political instrument. Some Bakhtin's ideas are reflected in Marxism feminism discourse. Also, we can mention the reflection in language, the social processes, and even a linguistic current in Japan, linguistics current and school in Japan. We find the trace in a semiotic discourse about signs from Marxism and philosophy of language and Bakhtin's myths. Of course, in linguistics and teaching, the ideas of Soviet linguists are also present. The ideas of Jakubinski are used sometimes by some politicals. Then, for example, when the political won't be more close, as mentioned, some researcher close for people, they start to use the special lexic or special pronunciation of words. I think that ideas of Polivanov, Bakhtin, Jakubinski, and Voloshinov may also affect the sociology and psychology, even psychiatry in our times of interdisciplinarity. And I really sorry for my presentation because I think that I will have more time, and I hope that I can make some panorama of ideas and the influence and for our current state. And I hope I did that you would like from me. Unfortunately, we don't have a time to discuss in the good way all these ideas of Soviet linguistics. And I hope that some circle of discussion of Soviet linguistics can be realized. And before I finish, I would like to announce that in May at the University of Lausanne, we'll have a conference devoted to early Soviet linguistics. And you're really welcome to join us because we will celebrate the year of the born of USSR. And really thank you for your attention.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Daria, por
Sí,
esta...
perdóname porque no pienso que tengo más tiempo. No digo muchas cosas, perdóname.
No te preocupes, on time. Ha estado todo perfecto. Muchas gracias por tu brillante exposición. Creo que Daria ha demostrado lo que ya muchos intuíamos en la importancia del paradigma soviético versus el paradigma estructuralista que se difundió en nombre de Ferdinand de Saussure, y vemos cómo este paradigma soviético fue la semilla para la sociolingüística moderna, para la semiótica. Incluso no descartemos ese concepto de enunciado que adquiere sentido en contextos concretos, en la realidad social concreta. Estamos hablando de la pragmática, y vemos cómo, insisto, este paradigma soviético de Jakubinski, Polivanov, Voloshinov y Bakhtin influyen decisivamente en todas las corrientes lingüísticas modernas o en gran parte de ellas. Y es necesario ese trabajo que desde los años 80 el profesor Seriot, Bermezova, Simonato, ahora la compañera Zalesskaya están haciendo para traducir e interpretar los textos originales en ruso al francés y también, por ejemplo, al español, porque un trabajo sobre Jakubinski fue traducido al español en Argentina con ayuda del profesor Seriot hace unos años. Por tanto, esa labor que la Universidad de Lausana está haciendo para traer el texto original en ruso de estos autores a las lenguas romances es fundamental, y por eso todos los investigadores debemos estar agradecidos al Departamento de Lingüística de la Universidad de Lausana por este gran trabajo. Lo que veo que Daria ha creado o ha ofrecido como novedad es toda la importancia que Polivanov tiene a la hora de introducir una metodología moderna para enseñar las lenguas, es decir, la traducción e interpretación de lenguas que se está estudiando en la actualidad. Por lo que veo, tiene un método muy importante que ya creó Polívanov, y a él le debemos gran parte de sus avances. Por tanto, enhorabuena de nuevo, Daria, por esta conferencia que nos hace tener una perspectiva más amplia de lo que ha significado toda la escuela soviética de la lingüística en los años 20 y 30. Muchas gracias. Si alguien quiere hacer alguna pregunta o comentario. Ekaterina, por favor.
Thank you so much, dear Daria, for this very rich conference. Maybe just a little question. I know that you work much on the history of didactics, and you spoke today about the Soviet Union, but at the same time, in the 1920s, 1930s, in the Western Europe, there were maybe also some theories which were connected with the Russian language and didactics, how to teach Russian. In France, for instance, where they wrote about how to teach Russian. Could you say just a couple of words about it?
Yes, thank you very much, dear Ekaterina. I will try to say a couple of words because this is really my area to study, so I can speak by hours about it. And yes, but the situation, it was in France really different because Russian language in France was treated like really difficult language, and we can say that it's really similar to the idea of Polivanov. So with teaching the different language, this language cannot be taught without the method. And in the Russian in the 20s, 30s in France was considered like Latin language. So it was taught like a language that we will never speak. So the interest was how to read and how to know all grammars aspects of Russian language. And I think we have many I'm sorry. We have a lot of examples to show that, for example, the methods, it was all time the grammatical methods, and all time and it's the most interesting thing is that this approach was since 1916 in France. So it was taught with the idea not to speak but to read. Yes.
Thank you so much, and I think that's it's a very important point that even today we can find something useful there in the series of 1920s, 1930s. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
¿Alguien más quiere hacer algún comentario? Bueno, pues damos, sí, Johannes Angemühle, cuando quieras.
Hola, hello, thank you for this wonderful talk. Really very instructive. I wondered to what degree you would say that there is something like a Soviet linguistics. I mean, there's a great deal of influence from Western Europe. I mean, you mentioned Saussure, Freud. I mean, what is the kind of, I mean, is there something, I mean, isn't it kind of treacherous to say that there's something like a Soviet linguistics given the different strands and influences? And I mean, I also see quite a few differences from your talk about these 3, 4, 5 linguists. I mean, there's a certain interest in dialogicity. There's lots of interest in the social aspects. But every author has quite a distinct idea of language and meaning making.
Yes, of course, and that's why I say like implicity of explicity is the influence. And Soviet linguist, for me, so I use this term because I really don't know if we can say pre-Soviet linguists, because I don't know, maybe Patrick can help me. That can we really say that Voloshinov and, for example, Polivanov, they are Soviet linguists? Basically, they worked a little bit earlier, that the really Soviet linguistic was really start to be. And also, I think it was also the mutual influence. So one influenced others, and sometimes the ideas of many of Soviet linguists was Soviet all time, like early Soviet, pre-Soviet, I don't know. So pre-Soviet linguists were really knowing in the West and not in the Soviet Union, because it was banished, but they published it in French, for example. And they published it, their works in French language, in France, or in English, etc. So here, I think it's really interesting topic to study who influenced what and who influenced who, etc., etc. So I think it's really big and complete problem but it's really interesting problem for us, and it's really interesting work for us to really doing some good part of research on it.
Thanks.
Excelente pregunta, Johannes. ¿Alguien más quiere intervenir?
Do you hear me?
Sigue adelante, Patrick.
I would like to say a few words about the question if there exists something like a Soviet linguistics. First of all, we have to understand that structuralism and social linguistics are not contradictory. They are different points of view. So the people who speak about the so-called social linguistics, they have another object of knowledge, another object of discourse. What is quite more interesting is the way Saussure was understood in the Soviet Union before the last war. And for instance, you have to know that Saussure was considered as the chief of the so-called sociological linguistics in France. So it is extremely strange for us to listen to that, because for us, Saussure, of course, has nothing to do with social linguistics. Now, the second point is that you have to know that sociology was considered as a so-called bourgeois science, idealistic and reactionary in the 1930s, and it was prohibited. And it was prohibited to speak about sociology, and which was replaced by historical materialism by Bukharin, until Bukharin was arrested and shot. So please, you have to understand that many categories which are very familiar to us in the Western Europe are totally ununderstandable in the Soviet Union and vice versa. So please be careful. Anytime we have to, for instance, to invent a good social linguistics and a bad structuralism. This doesn't mean anything unless we explain exactly what the meaning of those items are. Thank you.
Maybe I can ask another question. I mean, I think Patrick Sérieux, you worked on the idea of the idea of the organic whole as a topic in Western thought, in European thought, that was then also taken up in Russia, and I would guess, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, that Russian semiotics that came a bit later, around Lotman and Uspensky, is one aspect of this kind of holistic idea of socio-cultural semiotics. How would you relate these linguists you just talked about to those strands of more holistic ideas of meaning making? I mean, I think that the linguists that we just saw, they're much more interested in the social situation and not so much in cultural systems of meaning making.
May I answer?
Sure.
I think one important point in our discussion is the difference between ontology and epistemology. I think the difference between holism, for instance, and structuralism is that structuralism by Saussure, for instance, is a point of view. And the main point of Saussure is that the point of view creates the object. Whereas for the ontological attitude, it's the all the way around. The object creates the point of view. And second, the holistic attitude was very frequent in the 1920s and 30s. Let's speak, for instance, of Berta Lanfi or von Uexküll. So all those people had the very romantic idea that everything is linked with everything, which you can find especially in Goethe, in German Romanticism. So I don't want to say that holism is not scientific. You just have to understand that there is a huge difference between the epistemological and ontological attitude toward the object of knowledge.
And so, I mean, who are the ontologists and who are the I mean, how would you relate this distinction to our linguists here and to Soviet semiotics and literature and linguistics?
Well, for instance, you can speak about the problem of typology. You see, typology in the Soviet linguistics before and after the war is quite more studied than, for instance, in France. Now, what is a type in this discussion? I think there is something in Russia which goes back to old Greek philosophy, Plato, and especially Plotinus, in the idea of the great whole. And for instance, the type for Lotman, I think it's not exactly the same idea that when you compare different languages, for instance, English and Chinese, everybody knows that the order of words is important in Chinese and English. So you have a common type, but not at all for Lotman. For Lotman, a type is something, it's sort of a deep essence of a culture. Cultural studies in Lotman is the Russian culture as opposed to the Western culture. So it's quite another way of speaking about typology. And I think once again, you should be very, very careful to the fact that the same word have different, deeply different meanings in Russia and in the so-called West. And typology is a very important topic in this discussion.
Thank you.
Bien, pues ha sido nuestra sesión más internacional. Se ha hablado inglés, español, algo de francés y algo de ruso. Así que os emplazamos, gracias a Daria y a todos los asistentes. Os emplazamos.
Muchas gracias.
Dime, Daria.
Muchas gracias.
A ti siempre. Por tu esfuerzo también en hablar español y en tu PowerPoint en español. Y os emplazamos para el mes que viene. Como digo, estará Óscar García Agustín hablando del lenguaje de la extrema derecha en Europa. iremos avisando. Muchísimas gracias y un fuerte abrazo desde Murcia, España. Un saludo.
Saludo, muchas gracias.
Chao.
Chao.